Section 1. Evening drifts across Venice like a practice performance. Lanterns reflecting on slow water, footsteps echoing beneath arcades, and inside a palazzo scented with wax and old silk, a noble woman pauses mid-step, listening not to conversation, but to music rising from somewhere she cannot see. She lives surrounded by chandeliers, etiquette, and inherited expectations, a mainstream historical reality for Venetian patrician women whose marriages were arranged as carefully as trade contracts, while historians still argue whether privilege softened or sharpened the limits placed upon them. Tonight the city prepares for another season of spectacle, masks laid out like permissions to forget oneself briefly, yet she feels unusually anchored, as though sound itself has reached inside and refused to let go. The melody below is unfamiliar, restrained, deliberate, carrying emotion without exhibition. And yes, this is one of those moments you probably won't survive easily, because it arrives quietly and rearranges everything without asking consent. Venice thrives on anonymity, a quirky civic habit where even neighbours may not know each other's faces during Carnival, and this culture of concealment makes longing both safer and more dangerous than elsewhere. She leans toward the balustrade, careful not to be seen, because being seen is the first mistake here, and watches shadows shift while the music continues, unclaimed, unannounced, and strangely personal. Court gossip praises music as harmless diversion, yet historians still argue whether art offered women a rare emotional outlet or simply another refined language for suppression, especially when feeling exceeded what words could safely hold. The composer remains unseen, masked by distance, rank, and intention, and that absence becomes part of the attraction, because imagination in Venice has always done most of the work. She tells herself this is appreciation, nothing more, the cultured response expected of her position, even as her breath slows to match the rhythm of a stranger's composition. Somewhere below, a servant closes a door, breaking the spell momentarily, and she straightens, startled by how far inward she has drifted without moving at all. Venetian society prizes composure above honesty, and she has mastered this performance well enough that no one notices the change now settling behind her eyes. The music ends without flourish, no applause following, which feels intentional, as though the composer prefers disappearance to recognition, a choice that intrigues her more than brilliance ever could. She remains still long after silence returns, listening for something that does not come back, because anticipation, once awakened, rarely accepts conclusion gracefully. Historians still argue whether such moments constituted the beginning of attachment or merely aesthetic indulgence, but standing here with her, the difference already feels irrelevant. As night deepens and Venice resumes its murmured rhythm, she moves away at last, carrying with her the unsettling knowledge that a masked presence has entered her thoughts and will not be easily removed. She hears him again days later, this time closer, the music drifting through an open courtyard at dusk, and she recognizes it instantly, which unsettles her. Because recognition implies attention, and attention once claimed begins to expect return. The composer performs from behind a screen, masked even outside Carnival season, a mainstream historical practice in Venice where musicians often concealed identity to navigate patronage, class boundaries, and rivalries, though historians still argue whether anonymity protected artists or simply commodified them more efficiently. She positions herself where sound gathers best, pretending interest in conversation while measuring pauses between notes, because listening carefully is one of the few freedoms afforded to women trained to observe more than act. A quirky Venetian belief claims music played over water carries truth farther than words, and perhaps that explains why his melodies feel uncomfortably precise, as though intended for someone listening with more than polite curiosity. He plays without flourish, avoiding the dramatic excess popular in salons, and this restraint draws her in, because understatement in a city of spectacle feels like intimacy offered privately, even when shared by many ears. She learns his habits indirectly, which nights he performs, when the courtyard falls quiet, how the servants linger when his music begins, and yes, this is where it becomes faintly ridiculous, because she now schedules her evenings around a man she's never seen. Historians still argue whether women of her rank experience such freedoms as indulgence or illusion, but standing here, one can feel how quickly admiration sharpens into dependence when imagination is given nothing solid to resist it. Once, their gazes nearly meet through the screen, an accident of timing and angle, and she looks away too late, which is to say, not at all, a mistake small enough to deny yet large enough to replay endlessly afterward. He pauses briefly, a hesitation so slight it could be coincidence, though coincidence in moments like this has a way of behaving suspiciously like acknowledgement, a detail that lodges itself firmly in her chest. Venice allows such almosts to exist comfortably, a city structured around proximity without disclosure, and she tells herself this is harmless, a shared aesthetic experience elevated by mystery rather than intention. A fringe note from a contemporary diarist mentions composers who preferred unseen audiences, claiming music listened to secretly carried more honest emotion, and she wonders, not for the first time, whether she is already complicit in something unnamed. Afterward, she returns to her chambers unsettled, replaying the melody with unnecessary accuracy, which would be impressive if it were not also alarming, because memory, once tuned, begins to demand repetition. She catches herself smiling at nothing, then corrects her expression quickly, because in a household where reputation is inherited, even unobserved joy feels like a liability, waiting to be misinterpreted. The composer departs without ceremony, his presence dissolving back into soundless anonymity, and she realizes too late that she prefers him this way, unseen, because seeing him might require decisions she is not yet prepared to imagine. As night closes over the canals, she lies awake listening to water lap against stone, and somewhere between one breath and the next, she understands that she is no longer merely hearing music, she's waiting for it. Waiting becomes a quiet habit, woven into her days without announcement, and she recognizes it only when a night passes without music and leaves behind an irritation that feels embarrassingly personal, because longing often reveals itself first as disruption rather than desire. She learns, through casual remark, that the composer is employed intermittently by different houses, a mainstream historical arrangement in Venice where musicians depended on patronage rather than fixed position, and historians still argue whether this instability fostered creative freedom or permanent vulnerability. This knowledge sharpens her attention because impermanence now carries consequence, and she begins to mark evenings not by invitations received, but by the possibility of his presence, a recalibration that quietly rearranges her priorities. A quirky Venetian superstition claims that repeated melodies bind listeners together invisibly, and she finds herself humming fragments of his compositions during the day, startled by how naturally they surface, as though memory has decided to rehearse without consulting reason. They do not speak, not even once, yet proximity accumulates meaning, and on one evening she deliberately lingers near the screen after others have drifted away. An act so small it feels deniable, yet intentional enough to matter. He senses it, or perhaps imagines it, because he adjusts his playing slightly, softening a passage, drawing out a pause, and historians still argue whether performers tailor emotion unconsciously to those who listen most closely. Her breath catches at the change, an involuntary response that feels absurdly intimate given the absence of touch. And yes, this is where the story becomes faintly dangerous, because emotional recognition has crossed the threshold of coincidence. Venetian society tolerates mystery, even encourages it, but emotional attachment without context unsettles the balance, because it resists classification, and what cannot be classified cannot be safely managed. Once, as the music ends, she hears a quiet intake of breath from behind the screen, unmistakably human, and the sound feels like an intrusion, a reminder that anonymity does not erase vulnerability, only redistributes it. She retreats quickly, heart racing, scolding herself for seeking confirmation of another's awareness. Because confirmation transforms admiration into complicity, and complicity demands choices she has been trained to avoid. A fringe note in correspondence from the era suggests that noble women sometimes fell in love with voices or talents rather than people, a claim often dismissed, yet standing here, it feels entirely plausible, even inevitable. She spends the following day restless, unsettled by how much power silence has acquired, because when meaning is unspoken, imagination is forced to do all the work, and it rarely chooses restraint. That evening he does not play, and the absence feels deliberate, as though distance itself has been introduced as a counterpoint, a musical pause extended beyond comfort. Historians still argue whether withdrawal signifies caution or invitation, but for her the effect is immediate and unmistakable. Waiting has shifted from anticipation to unease. As night deepens, she sits alone, listening to water and memory instead of music, aware that something has formed between them without permission, and like Venice itself, it floats precariously, beautiful and already difficult to control. By the time Carnival approaches, Venice feels sharpened by anticipation, masks multiplying in windows, voices loosening under sanctioned anonymity, and she senses the danger of the season immediately, because when everyone is allowed to hide, truths often surface without invitation. The composer returns during this charged interval, performing more frequently, his presence folded into celebration, a mainstream historical pattern in which music became both ornament and distraction, while historians still argue whether Carnival liberated desire or merely disguised its consequences. She attends gatherings she would normally avoid, drawn not by spectacle but by the possibility of sound, and this adjustment, small but deliberate, marks a quiet surrender of control she pretends not to notice. A quirky Venetian belief holds that masks reveal more than bare faces, and she feels this now, watching strangers move freely while she remains bound by reputation, longing for invisibility even as she fears what it might permit. One evening, the music shifts unexpectedly. A familiar melody altered just enough to feel like a question, and her pulse responds before thought intervenes, because recognition, once mutual, resists denial. Historians still argue whether such artistic variation indicates intent or coincidence, yet standing here with her the alteration feels deliberate, placed carefully where she cannot ignore it without betraying herself. She remains hidden among silk and shadows, but her attention is no longer private, and she realizes with a quiet jolt that she is being played to, not as audience, but as presence, which changes everything. Jealousy arrives without drama, sparked by the sight of other women lingering too closely, their laughter careless, and yes, this is one of those uncomfortable moments where emotion exposes its own depth far more efficiently than confession ever could. The composer does not look toward them, maintaining his practiced invisibility, and this restraint both reassures and wounds her, because anonymity now feels less like protection and more like distance enforced equally on everyone. She leaves early, pulse unsteady, scolding herself for expecting exclusivity from a man she's never met, a thought so unreasonable it almost makes her laugh, though the laughter never quite arrives. Outside, carnival noise swells, masks brushing past her, and she experiences a sharp modern irony. We invent celebrations of freedom, only to discover they illuminate exactly what we are most afraid to lose. A fringe anecdote from Venetian moral tracts warns of women undone by art rather than men, and she recognizes herself uncomfortably in the phrasing, because it is the music, not the composer, that has breached her defences. The following nights feel different, charged with unspoken awareness, and she senses that avoidance is no longer neutral, that choosing not to attend is itself a decision with weight. Historians still argue whether restraint preserves dignity or delays harm, but within her chest the debate collapses into something simpler. She wants to know who he is, even if knowing ends what has sustained her. As Carnival reaches its peak, she understands that concealment has carried them as far as it can, and whatever comes next will require a choice, whether spoken or enforced by silence. The danger sharpens not through exposure, but through awareness. Because once both understand the attention is shared, secrecy no longer feels accidental, and Venice, a city fluent in discretion, becomes suddenly crowded with risk, a mainstream historical tension during Carnival when anonymity protected desire, while also magnifying the consequences of being quietly, irrevocably noticed by the wrong eyes. She feels it in how servants watch more carefully, how conversations pause when she enters rooms she does not usually favour, and historians still argue whether Venetian society relied on formal surveillance or communal intuition. Though in practice, suspicion often travelled faster than proof, carried effortlessly through tone, timing and omission rather than accusation. The composer senses it too, adjusting his appearances, shortening performances, choosing obscurity over brilliance, and a quirky belief among musicians claims that restraint is the highest form of control, yet control exercised too late often reveals how much has already slipped beyond intention. Their connection deepens without proximity, sustained entirely through implication, altered melodies and strategic absence, which feels absurdly intimate. Because imagination, when denied confirmation, becomes more demanding, filling every pause with expectation and every silence with imagined meaning that grows heavier each time it goes unanswered. Jealousy tightens its grip quietly, not dramatic or possessive, but precise, as she notices who stands closer, who lingers longer, who laughs too freely, and she despises herself for it, because jealousy implies ownership, and ownership is the one thing she's never been permitted to claim in any form. Historians still argue whether such emotional intensity constituted love or projection, but standing here with her, the distinction collapses, because whatever its name, the feeling now shapes her choices, her movements, and the way she listens for footsteps that are not meant to matter, and yet matter profoundly. The composer avoids acknowledgement deliberately, maintaining his mask more carefully than before, and this restraint wounds her unexpectedly, because what once felt protective now feels like distance chosen, reminding her that anonymity can also function as refusal dressed politely in discipline. A fringe moral tract from the era warns that women undone by art rarely notice the unravelling until dignity has already absorbed the damage, and she recognises the truth uncomfortably because nothing visible has happened, and yet her interior life has shifted beyond recovery. She considers withdrawal, imagines reclaiming composure by absence, but absence now feels like abandonment of something fragile and real, and this is the cruel paradox Venice perfects. Once concealment enables attachment, retreat begins to feel like betrayal rather than safety. By the time Carnival wanes, she understands with startling clarity that secrecy has sharpened desire rather than containing it, and that whatever remains between them now exists beyond control, sustained not by contact, but by the shared dangerous knowledge that they are no longer imagining this alone. The unmasking arrives without ceremony, which is how truth tends to surface in Venice, not through confession, but through proximity misplaced, and she realizes it in an instant that feels both inevitable and unbearable, because once a face is known, imagination loses its safest refuge. It happens in a narrow passage after a performance, the crowd thinning, candles guttering low, when a masked figure pauses too long and the distance collapses into recognition. A mainstream historical risk during Carnival when anonymity faltered at the edges rather than the centre. She does not see him fully at first, only the outline of a jaw, the human warmth of breath, and that is enough, because reality once introduced carries a weight imagination never prepared her for. A quirky Venetian belief warns that removing a mask at the wrong hour invites irreversible consequence. And though no mask is lifted explicitly, something essential has already been revealed, rendering the warning painfully accurate. They do not speak, not because words are unavailable, but because words would demand decisions, and decisions in this city are rarely made without cost carefully calculated in advance. Historians still argue whether recognition alone constitutes intimacy, yet standing here it feels undeniable, because her heart responds with the sharp certainty of something finally aligned and immediately endangered. He inclines his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement restrained to the point of denial, and she mirrors it instinctively. An exchange so brief it could be dismissed, yet precise enough to replay endlessly afterward. In that moment she understands that the mask protected them not from each other, but from consequence, and that without it even silence becomes exposed, stripped of plausible innocence. He turns away first, discipline asserting itself automatically, and she allows him to go, because stopping him would convert recognition into demand, and demand into scandal, a progression Venice tolerates only when accompanied by ruin. As she returns to the lighted halls, heart steadying with effort, she knows the music will never sound the same again, because mystery has ended, and what remains, truth without permission, will require a different kind of restraint to survive. Silence follows the unmasking with unsettling precision, as though the city itself has agreed to look away, and she feels the shift immediately, because Venice, once indulgent of secrecy, now seems to demand resolution without offering any acceptable path forward. The composer withdraws from public performance, not abruptly but deliberately, a mainstream historical response for artists navigating patronage risk. and historians still argue whether such disappearances were acts of self-preservation or quiet expulsion disguised as choice. She hears fragments, an engagement elsewhere, a departure rumoured, a new patron, and each version contradicts the last, creating a haze of possibility that feels cruelly impersonal, because her story exists now only as conjecture carried by other people's mouths. A quirky Venetian belief claims that when music stops suddenly, it has not ended but relocated, and she clings briefly to this thought, listening for echoes in corridors where none arrive, learning the exhausting difference between hope and habit. They never speak again, not out of cruelty but because recognition has stripped silence of safety, and any further proximity would demand explanation, confession, or sacrifice. Currencies she does not possess equally in a city that measures women by discretion rather than desire. Historians still argue whether unfulfilled connection constitutes loss, but standing here with her, loss feels unmistakable, not because something was taken, but because something carefully built has been rendered unsustainable by truth. She resumes her role flawlessly, attending functions, receiving visitors, praised for composure that now feels less like grace and more like armour, because dignity, once reinforced by restraint, has become a structure she cannot safely dismantle. At night, she remembers music not as sound but as pressure, the way it once rearranged her breathing, and this memory feels both intimate and distant, like a language she once spoke fluently and now recalls only in fragments. A fringe note in later Venetian commentary suggests that the most dangerous romances are those resolved without scandal, because they leave no outlet for grief, and she recognises the accuracy of this with a quiet, modern irony that almost makes her smile. As months pass, Venice absorbs the absence efficiently, and she understands with a steadiness earned through endurance that what survives now is not possibility, but echo, less volatile, less hopeful, yet stubbornly present all the same. History does not preserve their names together, which feels appropriate in a city that perfected selective memory, because Venetian records favour contracts, alliances and patronage over unfinished emotions. And historians still argue whether such omissions reflect cultural restraint or a deliberate narrowing of what was allowed to endure. He is remembered, if at all, as a composer who moved on, his work attributed, circulated, detached from the moment it once meant something privately, while a fringe belief among musicians insists that the truest compositions are those written for a single listener who is never acknowledged. She remains within her circle, aging gracefully into respectability, her attentiveness admired, her restraint praised, and those who know her only by reputation would never suspect how deeply sound once shaped the architecture of her inner life. They do not cross paths again, not because Venice forbids it explicitly, but because structure succeeds where passion hesitates, arranging schedules, distances and obligations so efficiently that chance itself is quietly neutralized. Sometimes she imagines hearing his music again, then realizes the melodies that return are not his but hers, altered by memory, softened by time and carried forward without permission, which feels oddly reassuring. Historians still argue whether love that leaves no trace can be counted as love at all. But standing here at the end, the question feels unnecessary, because absence has shaped her life with undeniable precision. A quirky observation from later Venetian writers suggests that the city's greatest romances survive not in confession, but in discipline, in what was felt fully and then carried alone, and this story fits that pattern with unsettling accuracy. In the end, nothing collapses, no scandal erupts, No vows are broken aloud, and yet something irreversible has occurred, because restraint has not erased love, only transformed it into memory, habit, and a quiet endurance that asks for no witnesses. Venice settles into night once more, water smoothing reflections into something almost kind, lanterns blurring, footsteps fading, and if you listen carefully, you can still sense how sound once mattered more than sight. Stories like this do not seek resolution. They seek acknowledgement, a gentle recognition that some connections exist only long enough to change us. She lives on in history as composure, as elegance, as silence correctly maintained. He survives as music separated from context, admired without intimacy, and that is all right. Not every truth requires exposure to remain true. If you're listening now, lights low, thoughts drifting, let the echoes fade gently. Let what remains settle into understanding rather than regret. Some loves arrive only to teach us how carefully we can feel and how quietly we can endure. End of script. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. May everything unfold kindly for you.